Welcome to The Debate. Have you ever noticed how borders on the political map are drawn with these hard, definitive black lines?
Yeah, they're very absolute.
Right. You step a single inch across one of those lines, and suddenly you're in a completely different jurisdiction, subject to entirely different laws.
Right.
But when you look at a topographical map, the reality on the ground is entirely different. Mountains, valleys, rivers, they bleed into one another. There are no sudden lines, just gradual shifts in elevation and, ecosystem.
Which is a much messier way to look at the world, honestly.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at a linguistic map specifically focusing on the Thedi-Anga language. Now, this is spoken across a vast stretch of eastern India, including the Anga region, Begusarai, Munger, and even reaching up into parts of Nepal and West Bengal.
It covers a huge area.
It really does. And our central question today is about where we draw the line on that map. Does Thedi-Angika possess a grammatical and phonetic structure that makes it a fundamentally distinct autonomous language, or
is it more accurately understood as a highly developed dialect? One that forms a continuous sort of fading linguistic topography with Maithili, Magahi, and Bengali.
precisely? And I'll be arguing that Thedi's unique morphological and phonetic rules establish it as a fully independent language system.
And I'll be taking the stance that its shared roots and grammatical frameworks represent a regional dialectal continuum, one that is deeply interdependent with its neighboring tongues. And, what makes this question so fascinating right now is that we aren't just dealing with abstract theory here.
No, we have concrete data.
Right. This whole discussion is emerging directly from a remarkable structural analysis provided in a comprehensive grammar guide. The text is called Maithili Samanantar Vyakaran Rachna e Bhasha Vigyan. And it's a text that meticulously maps the morphological rules, the sounds, the sentence architecture of how people actually speak in this region.
It is incredibly detailed. And honestly, when you dive into that text, you can't help but conclude that Thedi-Angika is unequivocally an independent language system.
Well, I wouldn't say unequivocally.
I would. It's a status built on unique grammatical frameworks and exclusive phonetic rules that you just don't find elsewhere. And this isn't just a matter of regional pride, either. This independence is practically cemented by its recognition as the second official language of Jharkhand.
Sure, the political recognition is there.
But the linguistic evidence backs it up. The text gives us overwhelming evidence of its autonomy, from its highly specialized noun system to, the social dynamics baked right into its verbs. Dismissing it as just some co-language totally ignores the deep semantic precision built into its framework.
I hear that, but I approach this with a bit more skepticism regarding those strict linguistic borders you opened with. When you analyze that exact same source material, Thedi-Angika presents to me as a textbook example of a dialectal continuum.
A textbook example?
Absolutely. George Grierson, back in his 1903 linguistic survey, classified Thedi-Angika as a Chiki-Chiki co-language of Maithili.
Right, but that was over a century ago.
But the historical roots remain. If you view its frameworks through a broader historical lens, drawing on its origins from Magadhi Prakrit through Apabhramsha and Avahata, you see a brilliant but deeply interdependent regional dialect. It shares its fundamental root DNA, specifically Tatsam and Tadbhav words, with those neighboring tongues. It's not an isolated linguistic island.
Okay, let's get right into the mechanics of why I think the dialect label falls terribly short. Let's start with the phonetic inventory and word formation.
Okay, let's hear it.
The grammar guide highlights phonetic tendencies that are entirely unique to Thedi-Angika. For instance, the presence of the conchathya, or guttural, vowel ah.
The ah sound?
Yes. The text explicitly notes that this specific sound, which originates deep in the back of the throat, separates it entirely from standard Hindi and Maithili. It physically requires a completely different mouth posture.
It's a distinct sound, I'll grant you that.
But even more compelling than the sounds themselves is the morphology, how it actually builds words. The Thedi-Angika utilizes a completely unique three-tier noun formation.
Ah, right. You're talking about the lagu, gru, and atric tiers.
Precisely. You have the lagu, which is the short or standard form, like chat for small or fudan. Then you have the guru, the extended or long form, which changes to chat ka or fudana.
Right.
And then, and this is the kicker, it goes a step further with the atirict, the extra or extreme form, utilizing suffixes like ma or wa, giving us chat kawa or fudanma.
Sure, the suffixes are very localized.
I see why you want to brush that off as just a regional continuum, but let me give you a different perspective. Suggesting this is just a regional variation is like looking at the distinct branching of an evolutionary tree and calling it all just trunk.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it?
I don't think so. This three-tier noun system requires a completely different cognitive mapping from the speaker. You aren't just pronouncing a Meitei word with a different accent. You are categorizing the objects in your world through a completely distinct structural lens. You're judging familiarity and specificity before you even finish saying the word.
Okay, that is a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual mechanisms of phonetic shift at play here?
What do you mean?
Let's look at the consonants, because that gives us a major clue about how this language evolved over the geography you mentioned earlier. The text details a phonetic tendency known as viprei.
The interchangeability of sounds, right?
Exactly. Specifically, the letters L, R, and N. Over time and distance, as spoken language travels across rivers and valleys, humans tend to naturally gravitate towards sounds that are easier to articulate in quick succession.
Sure, phonetic laziness, basically.
Well, efficiency. So the standard Indo-Aryan word nadi for river becomes ladi in Tethyangica. The word rahari becomes lahari.
Right.
This kind of interchangeability is a classic, universally recognized marker of a regional dialectal variation. It is exactly what happens when a root language travels across a geographic space. It doesn't signal the genesis of a wholly new autonomous language. It just signals colloquial adaptation.
But adapting a few consonants doesn't explain the complex suffixes we just talked about.
Well, regarding that three-tier noun system, I agree, it is structurally fascinating. But applying suffixes like ma or ba to create fudanma or maliba from the root word mali are, at their core, localized colloquialisms.
I totally disagree with that framing.
Hear me out. They are operating on a shared Indo-Aryan, specifically Magadhi root. The foundational engine of the car is the same. The region has just painted the chassis a different color to suit its local aesthetic and cultural needs.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning at all, because you're treating deeply embedded morphological suffixes as mere paint.
Because functionally, they are decorative.
They absolutely aren't decorative. They fundamentally change how a speaker interacts with the noun, denoting precise levels of affection, derogation, or extreme specificity. But fine, if you want to use the car metaphor and talk about the engine of the language, let's leave the nouns and look at the verbs.
Okay.
Because this is the most undeniable evidence of autonomy in the text. Let's talk about the Shrutisamband.
The listener relation in verb conjugation. Yeah, it is definitely one of the most striking features in the book.
It is staggering when you really unpack it. Think about it in most standard languages. How does a verb conjugate?
Usually by subject or tense.
Right. It changes based on the subject, I eat, he eats. Or it changes based on the tense, he ate. Sometimes gender. But Tithyangica adds an entirely new layer of social dynamics into the very architecture of the syntax.
Yeah.
The verb changes based entirely on the speaker's relationship with the person they are talking to.
Right. Not the person doing the action, but the person hearing the sentence.
Yes! Imagine you and I are standing in a field watching a third person eat lunch. If you, the listener, are somehow connected or related to the action, what the text calls a sambad listener, I would say to you, "A kal kau," which translates to, "Did he eat?"
Right, because I am connected to the situation.
Exactly. But if you are totally disconnected, just an ordinary third party passing by and a sambad listener, the verb shifts entirely. I would say, "All kai che." Think about the cognitive load of that.
It's immense.
The speaker has to subconsciously process their social relationship to the listener, weigh the listener's connection to the subject, and then conjugate the verb accordingly. That is an incredibly sophisticated, independent syntactic architecture. That isn't just painting the chassis. That is an engine completely rebuilt from the ground up to prioritize social hierarchy and connection.
I absolutely acknowledge the brilliance of that nuance. The Shruta Samband is a stunning feature of human communication. And you're right, it requires incredible social processing.
Thank you.
However,
There it is.
we have to look at the actual vocabulary driving that feature. How is it doing this mechanical work? It relies heavily on the auxiliary verbs, the Sahaya Kriya, specifically the sounds chi, chai, and chakai.
Yes, the defining verbs of the region.
And here I have to bring us back to the historical record, specifically Grierson's survey from 1903.
The survey that classified it as a subdialect, which we already established is outdated.
But the logic holds up. He explicitly classified Daithiyangika as a Chai-Chikini co-language of Maithili. Why? Because this exact reliance on the Chai and Chekai sounds is the very feature he used to label it.
Just because they share sounds?
He recognized that using these specific auxiliary verbs as a defining grammatical glue proves it is a variation of the broader Maithili continuum. The new grammar guide we are looking at today explicitly lists these auxiliary verbs as the heart of the grammar.
Right, they are the pistons in that engine I mentioned.
But those pistons are part of a shared regional linguistic ecosystem. They are a hyper-local adaptation of Maithili verb structures, not an entirely alien system dropped from the sky.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it very differently.
How so?
Well, if we dismiss these incredibly complex, listener-dependent verb conjugations as mere regional adaptations just because they share root sounds with Maithili, aren't we applying a massive double standard here?
A double standard? I don't follow.
Look at how we classify languages globally. We grant fully independent autonomous language status to European languages based on far less syntactic divergence.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Take Spanish and Italian. They share massive amounts of syntax, vocabulary, and root sounds from Vulgar Latin.
True.
Yet they are universally recognized as distinct languages, not just a dialectal continuum of Latin. If they get independent status, how can we look at an Indo-Aryan language that literally alters its verb structure based on social listener dynamics and just wave it away as a mere co-language? Daithiyangika has earned its independent status through extreme semantic precision.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that comparison.
Why not? It's the exact same linguistic phenomenon.
Let me tell you why. The European language comparison almost never maps perfectly onto the Indo-Aryan linguistic reality in eastern India.
It maps structurally.
No, because the sociolinguistic history, the way communities intermingled without hard national borders for millennia, is entirely different. You have a constant flow of Magadhi Prakrit evolving through Apabhramsha and Avahata into these modern forms. But look, let's look closely at that semantic precision you mentioned, because I do actually agree the text highlights something beautiful there with those auxiliary verbs.
It really does. Let's look at the microscopic distinction between the auxiliary verbs chai and chakai.
Right.
The text is very clear on this, and it proves how evolved this system is. Chai denotes mere existence. So if I want to tell you there is water in a glass, I say, giles mi pani chai. It simply points to the fact that water happens to be present in that location.
Right, it simply exists.
But chikai denotes identity. It is a definitive marker of what a thing fundamentally is. If someone asks what the clear liquid in a bottle is, and I want to say, this is water, meaning this substance is defined as water and nothing else, I say a pani chikai.
The existential versus the definitional.
Exactly. This splitting of the standard to be verb into two distinct streams, one for existence, one for fundamental identity, is the hallmark of a mature, separate language. It allows speakers to convey microscopic nuances of reality that would require entire, clunky explanatory phrases in standard Hindi or even English.
I come at it from a different way.
Of course you do.
I agree that the semantic split between chai and chekai is a beautiful nuance. It gives the speaker incredible philosophical precision about existence versus identity. But step back from that one beautiful leaf and look at the macro structure housing it. Look at the broader syntactic rules the grammar text details. When you want to form a sentence in Theta Angaka, how do you do it?
You follow standard subject-verb agreements?
Exactly. They follow the exact simple, mixed, and compound what the text calls Saral, Mishra, and Sanyukt sentence structures of standard Indo-Aryan languages. And how does it build its vocabulary? It relies heavily on Tatsam and Tadbhav words.
But every language in the region borrows from Sanskrit.
Yes, but it's how it borrows them. It uses Tatsam words, which are words imported completely unchanged. Pure Sanskrit, like Agni for fire or Surya for sun.
Right.
And it uses Tadbhavar words, which are the modified, evolved forms, like Agi or Suraj. It's drinking from the exact same lexical well. Furthermore, look at how the language handles poetic expression or complex ideas.
You're talking about the Alankars.
Yes. The text explains it uses traditional figures of speech, the Shabdalanka, which are sound-based figures like anupras, or what we would call alliteration, and it uses arthalankar, meaning-based figures like upama, which is a standard simile.
Well, I don't think anyone is arguing it doesn't share ancient historical roots.
But it's not just ancient history, it's the current active scaffolding of the language today. Look at the compound words, the samas.
Okay.
The grammar guide shows it uses the exact same compound structures, like the tatpuhush, where the second part of a compound word determines the meaning, like saying king's man, or the bahuvahi compound, where two words combine to point to a completely different third thing, like saying blue neck to mean the god Shiva.
I'm familiar with the structures.
Right. So you see my point. The entire scaffolding, the subject-predicate syntax, the derivation of nouns, the compounds, it all maps perfectly onto the shared historical Maithili Magathi framework. The semantic split of chai and chekai is fascinating. Yes, but it operates entirely within this traditional syntax.
So you're saying it's just a branch?
It is a highly specialized, deeply fascinating branch, but it is undeniably attached to the larger tree. You cannot sever a branch and call it a separate tree just because its leaves are a slightly different shade of green.
Okay, but at what point does the branch become heavy enough, complex enough, and distinct enough that it touches the ground and takes root itself?
That's a very poetic way to phrase it.
Well, because when you look at the totality of what we've discussed today, the sheer weight of the language's unique mechanics is undeniable. We have seen that Thithi Angika possesses exclusive phonetic markers like the guttural aw that physically alter pronunciation.
Yes, it does.
It possesses a three-tier noun structure of lagu, guru, and atirik that fundamentally alters how a speaker cognitively maps their environment and their relationships to objects.
Structurally unique? Yes.
And most importantly, it rebuilt the engine of its verbs, employing the socially complex Shrota Samband to alter conjugations based on the listener, alongside an existential and identificational split in its auxiliary verbs. This is not just a collection of localized rural colloquialisms or a slightly different shade of green.
I think the weight of the historical evidence.
This is an overwhelming body of evidence pointing to a distinct, autonomous language that has rightfully earned its independent recognition in Eastern India.
And while I hear that, and I appreciate the passion, I have to return to the reality of the topography we discussed earlier.
The messy map.
The messy map. No one is denying the intricacy or the beauty of Thedi Angaraga, the extreme semantic precision of chai versus chakai, and the fascinating listener relation verb rules truly are masterclasses in human expression.
Agreed?
However, when we look at the phonetic phenomenon of viparye, the L, R, and N interchangeability, we are looking at the literal footprint of a language walking across the geography, shifting its sounds for ease of use. That is a classic dialectal shift.
But that's just one aspect.
But it's foundational. When we trace its origins from Magathi Prakrit and observe its heavy, ongoing reliance on shared Indo-Aryan sentence structures, Tatsam vocabulary, and standard grammatical frameworks like the Samas compounds, its historical and present evolution remains clear.
To you, maybe.
It is a brilliant jewel, perhaps the most intricately carved jewel in the region, but it sits within a larger interdependent Maithili-Magathi dialectal continuum.
Well, it seems we are arriving at a point of convergence on the sheer brilliance of the mechanics, even if we fundamentally disagree on the final classification.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Because the tension between defining a language versus a dialect really does seem to rest precisely on this line. Where does one draw the boundary between structural uniqueness and historical shared origins?
Right. At what point does an adaptation become an invention?
Exactly.
And perhaps the most valuable takeaway from the Maithili Samanantar Vyakaran text isn't actually the label we slap on the cover of the book.
No.
No, I think it's the immense value of studying these specific grammatical nuances themselves, understanding how a speaker consciously navigates a three-tiered noun system or how they calculate social proximity before they conjugate a verb, helps us better understand how human expression itself evolves to meet the needs of a community.
I couldn't agree more. And for those interested, there are even more layers of morphological complexity in the source text regarding adjectives, prepositions, and compound words that we haven't even had time to touch on today.
Which means there is so much more for the listener to explore in the material itself.
Absolutely. We started today by talking about maps, the hard black lines of political borders, versus the gradual bleeding shifts of a topographical landscape. Perhaps the mistake is trying to force a messy, human topographical reality into a rigid political framework.
That might be the truest thing said today.
Whether you see Thini Angika as a sovereign linguistic nation standing on its own or as a magnificent, unique valley within a much broader continent, the terrain of this language is undeniably rich and worth exploring. Thank you for joining us.